Great, so thanks everyone. So today I'll be talking about language test performance and the real world. This is something that's an important connection to make for any kind of test really, but especially for higher stakes proficiency tests that are commonly used for things like higher education admissions, immigration, and so on. So yeah, I'm very pleased to be here, and thanks to Cyberway for inviting me and hosting me again this summer. And so, as you can see, I'm from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, Department of Second Language Studies. So the goal of this talk, I just wanted to share some of my thinking about what tests can tell us about real-world performance. And these thoughts, I feel like I'm still developing them. I'm certainly drawing on what others have previously written about, thought about, but in connection with some research I've been doing for the past couple of years, I've been thinking hard about this question, and I just wanted to share with you all what I found and some implications or some questions that I have for the field of language testing and the use of language tests out there in the real world. So as a bit of an overview, I'll be talking initially about validity and test use and how these two things are really intimately connected, and also about validity evidence, because a lot of the research I'll be highlighting has to do with validation, which is the process of evaluating empirically whether a test achieves what we have designed it to do. And so I'll be highlighting several studies, about 5 different studies that I've been involved with that have something to do with what do test scores mean in the real world. And towards the end, I'll raise some implications and questions. All right, so the main issue here is test performance and real world performance. Is what we see on the test, what we see people doing, the scores they get, is that indicative of what they can do in the real world? In other words, is the test relevant to some real world decision-making context? Are the test results meaningful in the context of a university, in a workplace, or some other area where we think it's very important that somebody's able to perform, at least linguistically, at a fairly high level? And so we look at things like test scores and performance characteristics. So for language tests, we can linguistically analyze what people do on the test. And then we try to make connections to the real world. We look at how people perform in real world scenarios. So I'll talk about some different forms of evidence later, but we'll be looking at making these connections. And this is important because if we're going to use a test, it ought to be relevant for the purpose, the context that we're going to use it in. I want to take a step back here though first and talk a little bit about validity as a starting point to illustrate particularly why test use and the places, the context in which we use tests really do matter a lot. So the definition of validity according to the standards for educational and psychological testing, this is the American Educational Research Association, National Council on Measurement and Education, and what was the third one? The American Psychological Association. So it's sort of like a consensus document across several different professional fields, like what are we talking about with validity? It's the degree to which evidence and theory support the interpretation of test scores for proposed uses of tests. So uses of tests are right in there. A test itself can have scores that might be consistent, they might be meaningful, and that's wonderful. In fact, we need them to be consistent and meaningful, but there has to be some connection to the use of the test scores when we think about validity. So interpretation, if we unpack this definition, we're essentially getting at what do the test scores mean? And that's usually with regard to a construct that's defined by the test developer. The uses of tests have to be connected to real-world contexts. Usually we're making decisions about people. Should we admit this person to the university? Should this person qualify for a visa to reside in a particular country? Should we hire this person? Should we promote that person? Okay? And as you can see from the examples I've just given, these are pretty high stakes decisions in a lot of cases, especially when the tests we're using are proficiency tests, kind of global proficiency tests. Of course, classroom teachers also give tests and make decisions about students. Did this student successfully learn the material that was taught? Should this student progress to the next grade? And those decisions are important too, but the stakes are a little bit lower. But I think hopefully all of this will be relevant to you whether you're teaching in a classroom and doing more classroom-based assessment, or if you are more concerned with the world of higher stakes testing. Okay, so the use of tests, again, it's connected to real-world context, and so we'd expect that a test should be relevant to a given real-world context in order for us to use it. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about constructs as well before we move on. So constructs can be sort of considered along two major types. We have trait-like constructs and then performance-based constructs. So trait-like constructs are often what I think we first think about when it comes to a construct. We're thinking about a theoretical construct. We have some idea of what language is and language ability or proficiency is in a person. Okay, constructs, you know, these trait-like constructs, they're strongly informed by theory. They also have this sort of orientation, this ontological orientation that they are real. We assume that the construct, as we've defined it, to the best of our abilities, is real. Like language is living in our head, literally. Like we have it there, it's real, it's something we draw on to do language, right? And trait-like constructs, we can't observe them directly, right? We don't have microscopes that can look in people's heads and find the language bit and see how big it is. We don't have that luxury like physical sciences do. So we rely on observable behaviors, right? We look at the language people do, that they produce, that they use to communicate, and we look at that as sort of indirect evidence that our trait is there, or that a trait level is high or something like that. In sort of contrast are performance-based constructs. And these are usually more loosely defined. Miss Levy talks about sets, and Kane talk about sets of performance consistencies. And by performance consistencies, it's a little abstract, but I think what they're getting at is people consistently perform in sort of predictable ways, right? So they consistently do some things well. Some people are just better at doing something than others. And other people on the lower end, you can have low ability here. You just sort of consistently don't perform quite as well. And these constructs are more or less informed by subject matter experts, needs analysis, things like that. So particularly in vocational education and assessment, you know, we don't have a strong like trait-like theory of like, what does it mean to be a good accountant? Like what is the theory of accountancy, right? But accountants have to take exams, right? So experts have sort of defined what sort of content knowledge do accountants need? What sort of maybe skills should they be good at, like with basic mathematical operations, being able to understand concepts like interest accumulation and all that. And so for language, we've done a lot of the same things. Kind of famously, the TOEFL, the IBT, leans heavily on this idea of performance consistencies, because the argument was, well, we know what language is, we know a lot about SLA, but we don't have a really strong theory of academic English. It's more about consistent sort of language-related behaviors that are associated with success in an academic context. And so here we get to step back a little bit from theory, and there's really no underlying cause of observable behaviors. It's not a hidden cause. We just sort of accept the behaviors, what we see, the performance consistencies, for what they are. So these are the two major types, and I wanted to set this up. It'll matter a little bit later when it comes to looking at evidence to support the relevance of test scores and their constructs. And I'll also point out that there is this sort of third way, this sort of hybrid approach that recognizes that, okay, we probably have strong enough theory for what language is and how proficiency works, how it develops. But at the same time, we know that real-world performance is not highly predictable based on somebody's, TOEFL score or ACTFL rating, right? We see a lot of performance variation from context to context. So there's some sort of mediating potential or mediation going on related to context that sort of adds some noise or disrupts the relationship between the trait we think people have and what we see them actually do. Okay, so these constructs are really core to validity. And in an argument-based approach to validity, we end up thinking a lot about constructs, but also a lot of other things. And we try to integrate various claims about validity, right, which is the interpretation and use of test scores, in a series of inferences. Okay, and so these are a series of claims that sort of take us from point to point, starting from what's on the test to how we're using it. And we have to evaluate validity here holistically. We're looking at the overall strength of the argument. So this also means that if there are any critical weaknesses or gaps in terms of evidence for validity, that poses a major problem for the whole argument. So these arguments tend to look something like this. We might start off with observations of what a person can do with language on a test. And then from those observations, right, whether it's a response to an independent speaking task or a selection of a multiple choice question, we score it, we evaluate it, right? Was this better or worse? Was this right or wrong? And then from those observed scores, we can kind of sum them up at the test level, and then we look at how reliable those are. That gets us our expected scores. And then we interpret those scores. And this is where the construct comes in, whether it's a trait-like construct or a more loosely defined set of performance consistencies. And so explanation here is what I want to highlight. This is where we get at interpretations. We make some claims about what the test scores mean, and those inform our interpretations, right? So this TOEFL score of 89, what does that mean, right? We think it means something about somebody's capacity to perform academic English in the domain. But we don't really get to the domain until we start thinking about another inference called extrapolation. Okay, so I'm going to highlight these two. Explanation and extrapolation both have to do with constructs. Explanation is kind of what is the construct and how do the scores relate to it. And then extrapolation is this construct and the associated scores or other aspects of test performance, do they predict, are they relevant to what people can actually do in the real world, right? So it kind of gives the construct life outside of the test. It's not just like, this is the TOEFL construct and it's a TOEFL thing and it tells you how well you can do on TOEFL, okay? What we really care about is, does that TOEFL score meaningfully predict or relate to what people are able to do in the real world? Okay, so we need to collect evidence to support these different inferences, like explanation, extrapolation. And also these things can be challenged. We might find evidence that goes against these inferences, that undermine them, right? So maybe everything looks good, you know, we think the content of the test is good and it gets us observations we can score, the reliability of the test is good, and our theory says, yeah, this is a really good measurement of academic English. But then if we find weak or no evidence that how people perform on the test is related to how they do in academic settings in real life, the whole argument gets a lot weaker. And we can say, actually, that inference is not well supported, and in turn, maybe this test shouldn't be used in the context that we thought we could use it in. Okay? And there are further inferences that have to do with the consequences of test use, but I'm going to sort of skip over those today because I'm sort of focusing on construct-related ones, particularly extrapolation. Okay. So as I mentioned, it's explanation and extrapolation that have the most to do with test constructs. And explanation, you know, whatever the test is, whatever you might formalize the argument as, the general gist of it is that the test scores are indicators of the target construct, whether it's a trait-like or more performance consistency related. And then extrapolation is that test performance, and we can think of performance on a test as your score, how high was it, low was it, but also, and this is something exciting to me at least about language tests, is we often have performance tasks on language tests. We get to see what people can do, actually produce language spontaneously. And so we can look at that performance and analyze it linguistically and see how that lines up with performance outside of the test. So is the way people talk and write on the test, is that indicative of how they are able to communicate in the real world. And so we can sort of think of it this way. Whether your test has a trait-like construct or more of a performance-based construct, you need that extrapolation inference. Some people would argue if you have mostly a performance-based construct, the explanation inference is not that important because your test scores are just equivalent to the performance consistency, right? So Kane sort of thinks this way. And again, Chappell, I've been trying to pin down her thinking. The original TOEFL IBT argument does have an explanation inference, but in her recent book on validity, she doesn't give an example of the TOEFL explanation inference. She sort of glosses over it. She focuses on some other tests. So if you have a strong sort of more performance-based approach, you're not making a strong claim about underlying language ability, but you're just looking at what people can do. You don't need the explanation inference, but in any case, if you're going to use a test in the real world, extrapolation becomes very important. Because there are plenty of tests that are meaningful in the sense that their scores are, you know, representative of some underlying construct, but they might not be relevant to a particular decision-making context. An example I like to give when I teach testing classes is vocabulary tests. There's sort of a small industry, a cottage industry of English vocabulary tests, right? They're very popular among researchers. Some people like to use them for educational purposes too. You know, what level graded reader should we start the student at, right? So there's these vocabulary tests. They work well. I mean, psychometrically, they're highly reliable, item difficulty patterns in the way you'd expect it. We look at test-taking processes, you know, it all looks pretty good, and the scores are pretty meaningful. But would a vocabulary test alone be sufficient or highly relevant to trying to choose somebody to see, like, should they be a teaching assistant, which is a heavily speaking-oriented role, that sort of thing? Probably not. So a test could be meaningful, but it might not be relevant to a particular target language use domain. So we have to think about what our target domain is and establish some relevance. And others have written about this in other fields. So this is important. You know, we can't just assume that because the test, it features a lot of academic tasks, or it features a lot of, you know, lifelike, real-world type of tasks and human-to-human interaction or whatever. We can't just assume that how people behave on the tests will reflect how they behave or what they're able to do in real life. So this is a quote from Lave, and Robert Mislevy cited in his book, and it kind of stuck with me. It's not just us thinking about these things in the language education world. So Lave did this study about mathematical knowledge, mathematical reasoning, and he pointed out that you can give somebody a math test and they might perform well on it or not so well, but then you put them in the real world where they're supposed to use math, you know, like managing, like, okay, I've got $50 to spend on groceries this week and I'm going to the store. Can they do the mental math that is needed for shopping? And people might perform differently in that context than how they did on the test where things are very abstract, right? You're solving, this is a 3-digit, you know, addition problem, whatever. Does that actually inform us on how well people are able to deploy math in the real world? And so I think the language, in the language testing world, you know, we sort of learned our lesson to one large degree. High stakes tests don't include exclusively grammar and vocabulary items anymore, because those were too decontextualized, too limited. They weren't really relevant to actually communicating in your target language. They're not irrelevant to the construct, but they don't seem to adequately capture everything that we need to see going on in real world communication. Right? So if we get a mismatch like this, where the math test doesn't do a good job of predicting how well somebody can, you know, work a cash register or shopping, you know, Instacart shopping, whatever, we run into a real problem in trying to use this test. So Chappell has done a lot of really, I think, good writing, and she has very clear thinking on lots of things about validity, but I'm going to focus on what she said about extrapolation. So she sort of subdivides the main claim of extrapolation into 2 subclaims or warrants. And again, these have to do with indicators of target domain performance. And I sort of think of these as more general evaluations of how people do in the real world. and then also qualities of target domain performance. And I think for us in language, it's easiest to think of this as linguistic characteristics, okay? And I'll be highlighting many examples here shortly of what kind of linguistic characteristics might we be interested in. So both of these subclaims kind of support the overall extrapolation inference. We have the test scores and we have their performances from the writing tasks and so on. And if we can see evidence that the scores predict performance, that how they speak, write, use language on the test is also fairly consistent with how people are able to speak, write, use language in the real world, that ends up being pretty strong evidence where we can say, yeah, the test scores reflect samples of what we're looking for in the real world, right? They can sort of predict what we would expect. So in more detail, you can see that the TOEFL IBT, its validity argument, has these claims baked into it. And so they're looking at things, the TOEFL IBT being an academic test, we're looking at appropriate indicators of linguistic performance and also relationships to indicators of successful academic performance. So linguistic performance might be grades on English composition assignments, right? Expert ratings of how people do on linguistically in their assignments, but then also general indicators of academic performance, grade point average grades, right? That's typically what we're looking at. And then on the other side here, we're looking at performance features that are related to construct relevant things about language, okay? So this might include things like fluency indicators, accuracy, complexity, so on and so forth. And the TOEFL Essentials, which is a newer TOEFL test, has a similar argument in its, or a similar inference in its validity argument. And interestingly here, I don't know if you've all heard the news, but TOEFL IBT is going to be undergoing a major revision. And in 2026, it's actually going to be drawing heavily on what's in the TOEFL Essentials. Right? So I'll be actually talking about some research related to TOEFL Essentials in just a few minutes later in the talk. So this will be of ongoing importance, I hope. All right, so that's extrapolation for us, conceptually what it is. And I've talked a little bit about evidence for extrapolation. Beyond just what argument-based validity theorists sort of promote, Chappell, Kane, and so forth, there's broad alignment here too in sort of the field of educational measurement at large. So the standards outline several different forms of validity evidence, and it's organized a little bit differently than what Kane or Chappell would do with inferences, but they are pretty explicit about you need to have evidence based on relationships to other variables. And the convergent and discriminant evidence stuff, that's more classic construct validity. You know, does the TOEFL score correlate with the IELTS score, correlate with the Duolingo score, so on and so forth. That can help us pin down the construct a little bit. But also test criterion relationships are how the standards put it. And they talk about two types. So the criterion is something outside of the test. Predictive evidence or predictive validity, and concurrent evidence for concurrent validity. So these are things, again, if we have somebody's SAT score, can we predict their grades in college? If we have somebody's TOEFL score, can we predict their grades in college? That sort of thing. Or concurrently, you know, at about the same time. And so trying to connect these two, I've been sort of thinking about this a lot in research projects I've done. And kind of with a retrospective view, I've been sort of better able to organize or put all these things together across several different research projects. So again, when we look at test scores, the total score on the TOEFL, maybe a speaking section score, or even task level scores, we then look at performance indicators, which tend to be evaluations of performance in the real world. So at the most general level, the way I'm thinking of it here, is we have things like grade point average, teaching or other workplace job evaluations, right? And these are things that are not just related to language, but we think language should have some role in how well people do. We can then get into more narrow indicators that tend to be a little bit closer bound to the test construct itself, language. So we could look at somebody's TOEFL score and then have some teachers or other experts look at their assignments they submit in an undergraduate chemistry lab or undergraduate English composition course and just sort of evaluate them on quality or some linguistic qualities. And we're looking for evidence of a strong relationship there. And then another type, which I haven't really discussed yet, but we might just have stakeholder evaluations of the test performances. I feel like this one is on a little bit shaky footing. It doesn't actually look at how people do in the real world, the test takers, but it draws on people from the target domain evaluating the test performances, trying to decide, like, would this person be somebody I could understand in the workplace? Do I think this person would be effective at their job? That sort of thing. And so we can rely on expert knowledge of the target language use domain in evaluating test performances. And then when we start looking at performance characteristics, again, here we're in language tests going to be focused on language or linguistic aspects of performance. We can look at generally observed performance characteristics from the TLU domain, and this has mostly been done in corpus linguistic approaches. So we have some good corpora of academic English, like the MyCase corpus. And we can see, all right, so people writing assignments in English medium academia, like linguistically, what do those look like? And how similar is that to what we see from test takers on the TOEFL or IELTS or some other test? But like the stakeholder evaluations from performance indicators, these don't really observe the same people in both contexts. We can also look at subjective evaluations of performance characteristics. So we might have analytic ratings on student presentations. How good was their grammar? How good was their vocabulary use, and so on. And then we also have, and this is what I'm most interested in, we look at linguistic characteristics of test tasks, and then for the same people, we observe them in the real world and look at how or what kind of linguistic characteristics we see in their real world communication. So there's a lot going on here, is what I've started to realize. You know, there's a lot of different ways of looking at this kind of same fundamental question. Is this test relevant to the real world? The evidence you can bring to support this argument is quite varied, which can make it a little bit hard to interpret, I find. You know, we can't compare studies about GPA to fine-grained linguistic characteristics directly, right? So we need to start thinking more about how to integrate the information. So a little bit of what we found in terms of findings from other studies. With higher education GPA, so if we're thinking about academic English proficiency tests, we typically see small to medium correlations between English proficiency test scores and GPA. Ihlenfeld and Rios' meta-analysis, which focused on TOEFL and IELTS, on average, the correlation between a TOEFL score or an IELTS score and grade point average in an American or British university, typically, is only about 0.2. Most people, when they look at a correlation of 0.2, they're like, that's not big. Nobody would call that a big correlation generally. So, you know, some people kind of wonder, like, are these tests even good? Similar things have been found for the American SAT, right? It doesn't seem to predict strongly, in terms of a large correlation, academic performance. When we look at specific assignments, particularly those that are very language intensive, the evidence looks a little bit stronger. We see medium to large correlations, or up to large correlations. And so some studies that have looked at this have been done by Biber, Losa Malone, and Oki et al. When it comes to stakeholder evaluations, we actually see some of the strongest evidence, at least in terms, I shouldn't say strongest evidence, we see some of the strongest relationships. So if we ask, like Schmidgall and Powers did, they did a couple of studies on TOEIC. What they did is they had real TOEIC responses to speaking and writing tasks, and they had people who worked for international businesses in Japan rate these studies, or rate these performances. How good was this person's speaking? How easily could you understand them? Would you be sort of confident in them as a coworker, right? These ended up being rather large correlations, right? So that's what we found. Is this the strongest evidence? I'll have more to say about that a little bit later. Now, turning to test and non-test performance characteristics. For generally observed characteristics, where people compare test language to a corpus drawn from other people in the target domain, it's kind of mixed findings. Some studies have found that higher levels of performance, like on the Michigan test of English, are more similar to what people see in real-world academic and nursing contexts, which is sort of a good sign. So higher scores, their register characteristics sort of align a little bit better with the real world. But then other studies have found kind of more mixed findings, whether people are looking at complexity measures or other sorts of approaches to text analysis. You know, the argument has been that, like, oh, well, some of these test tasks don't have very similar levels of complexity or fluency or what have you to real world tasks. But these, again, are comparing test takers to a reference corpus. When we look at test taker performance characteristics, where we're looking at the same people in the test and outside of the test, we also, at least studies have tended to emphasize task level differences. So, for example, I think the Brooks and Swain study, this was conducted in Australia looking at TOEFL. They compared how people did on the TOEFL integrated writing task, I believe, no, speaking task, and then compared that to how they performed on a university academic speaking task. And they were focused on a whole range of features. They had some discourse stuff, some syntactic complexity, and they found that at the task level, you know, it was higher on the test and lower in real life, or vice versa, whatever this linguistic index was. But a problem, I think, in both of these lines of research is that very few, or maybe none of these studies, to my knowledge, have looked at person-level correlations or consistencies, right? I think we can accept that no test task perfectly replicates a real-world academic task, right? Tests always have this practicality compromise. We can't fully simulate anything in a test, but we can try. And so when we get task-level differences, that's not so surprising. But a question it raises is, do people who do relatively better in terms of some linguistic characteristic also tend to do relatively better in the real world? So that's an open question and something that I've been starting to try to answer in some research that I'll highlight here soon. So with all this validity evidence, I'll just point out that a really key thing is the generalization of the evidence itself. So you can do a test score and GPA correlation at one university, but that's not enough in many cases. It's good for that local context, but you're going to need to run a lot of different studies or collect data from a lot of different universities and then try to average out what can we generally expect in the target domain. So we've done a pretty good job of this when it comes to things like GPA, but for many other sources of evidence, there hasn't really been enough work that's been consistent enough to meta-analyze yet. So we do have some of these larger gaps. So I just wanted to bring that up. It's also a good idea for those of you looking for research projects. Oh, that was a really cool study they did at Georgia State University. Do it at your university. See if you get similar findings, and then eventually we'll be able to run a meta-analysis. All right, so now I'm going to turn to some of my research broadly related to extrapolation, and there are about 5 studies I'll talk about. Several of them, almost all of them at some level, include performance indicators, so real world sort of, whether that's GPA or expert grades or evaluations of assignments, and then also studies that feature linguistic performance characteristics. So the first one I want to talk about here is we did one of those GPA studies to kind of keep adding to the evidence. In particular, so at my university, like many universities, we started accepting the Duolingo English test during the pandemic, and we've come around to just accepting it in general. So we wanted to see, in particular, does that test seem to predict at least some small level of, to some small degree at least, some performance in the academic context. And we also have a lot of IELTS and TOEFL scores that get submitted to us. So what we're looking at here, this was our sample, not particularly big, but we have a few hundred people. And first we just kind of looked at test level differences. So if somebody submitted a given test, what was their average GPA, and we don't see many major differences. I'll note here that there's a no English proficiency category. These are people who, because they did maybe an associate degree or went to high school in the United States, they didn't have to submit a test score. And so we're not seeing really big differences there, right? But this is kind of at the test level, doesn't really tell us about individual performance so much. We also looked at negative outcomes, so beyond GPA as sort of a different kind of evidence. What proportion of people submitting these different sources of proficiency evidence end up going on probation or withdrawing from the university? And we're not finding big differences among the tests. But kind of, I think, more squarely related to what we're talking about today, in terms of indicators of performance, we look at their GPA. And so you can see here, when we combine all the data, graduate and undergraduate, the top row there don't seem to be really big differences across tests. IELTS looked like it had the biggest correlation overall, but nothing's really jumping out as large. All of these would be kind of small correlations. When we break it down by student level, graduate and undergraduate, kind of similar. IELTS seems to work really well if you just look at the correlation coefficient at the graduate level, TOEFL at the undergrad. A funny thing happened with Duolingo. It was like a negative 0.4 at the graduate level. But this is something too where it's like, we got to look at your data. Nobody who submitted DET at the graduate level was like doing badly, like most graduate students. Overachievers, they get really high grades, right? So there's a floor effect. We don't really have a big range of GPA here. So we looked at that, and like previous studies, these correlations tended to be small. And we broke it down further: unconditional admits and conditional admits. Kind of the same thing. We find kind of bounciness, different subgroups. We see stronger and weaker correlations, but nothing is jumping out as particularly large here. So some takeaways, right? These correlations with GPA can be bouncy, especially in the smaller sample we're dealing with. Cut scores seem to have a big role. We tended to see larger correlations for people who were conditionally admitted to our university. They had to take some English support courses, so we let them in with a lower TOEFL. The correlation was stronger. And then with this whole body of research, thinking about how persuasive is this evidence, in some ways, in an ideal world, you've got your cut score set just right to where beyond that cut score, there's no more added value to language proficiency, right? Because we know GPA depends on academic preparation, discipline knowledge, motivation, study habits, all this other stuff that's not language. So, small correlations, fine. It's about all we can expect, but maybe this isn't always this. Maybe this shouldn't be our only source of evidence for extrapolation. So now I'm going to move on to the second study. This is something we did with the Duolingo English speaking test, the speaking section of that test, and colleagues I worked with were Dustin Crowther and Hitoshi Nishizawa on this one. And here we're looking at stakeholder evaluations. So we got data from 100 Duolingo test takers, and they came from different backgrounds, and we got the whole range of proficiency captured by that test. And we got all their speaking performances and their speaking scores that were relevant. And we recruited now a bunch of listeners, largely from my university, from different sort of stakeholder groups: undergraduates, graduates, faculty members, and staff, which in the US context means administrators and support staff, advisors, registrars, things like that. And they were not all native English speakers, and they had kind of like similar levels of familiarity with foreign accents. And we let them listen to the speech that the test takers produced, and we asked them to rate it. How easy was it to understand? How acceptable would this speaker's English be for graduate study, undergraduate study, and so on? So we ended up with comprehensibility and acceptability for academic settings. And what we find here, honestly, when we did this study, I was sort of shocked. Like, I ran the statistics again, like, is it really this strong? Because people had a lot of criticisms of the Duolingo English test, still do. I was like, I didn't think I'd get correlations of almost 0.9 between the DET's conversation score and acceptability judgments from people who are blind. They didn't know the person's DET score, they just listened to them talk. And so they rated people with high DET scores. Yeah, this person sounds like they'd be fine in a graduate classroom. Okay. So these are very large correlations, but what we'll want to think about later is how strong is this evidence, or what kind of evidence, what degree of support does this offer? So again, we should probably expect this. If the test scores don't capture something about how people in the real world see or hear language ability, then there's probably a big problem. But again, a weakness here is we didn't actually get those same test takers to do a presentation in class. We're not observing the same people in different contexts. All right, so the third study, this is more of a general proficiency test. So we're going to take a bit of a step away from the academic context for a minute. This is a study we did, again, with my colleague Dustin Crowther, also Yoon-So Kim and Ji-Eun Kim, who's here in the room, for the British Council's aptness test. So this is used in a kind of a wide range of contexts. Some places use it for teacher qualifications, others use it for other educational purposes, but it's not specifically an academic test. It's getting at supposedly general English language proficiency. And so for this one, kind of like the Duolingo study, we got official test performances and scores, this time from 50 test takers. And we tried to capture a broad range of first languages. And we also got speakers from across the range of proficiency, from A1 up to C1, which is about the highest that the test measures. So we have very low and rather high levels of proficiency in here. And we have all their task recordings, their scores. We have their task level scores as well, which was something fun to look at. And then we recruited a whole bunch of listeners. We got people who were just users of English who were residing in the US or the UK. So they did not have to be first language speakers. Just English was their primary language, whatever that means. And they ranged in age between 18 and 64. They were not specifically professors or anything, just folks, anybody who was on this Prolific, which is a research recruitment pool. And we recruited so many people because we had a lot of speech for them to listen to. We couldn't ask one person to listen to like 4 hours of speech and evaluate it. So we gave them just subsets, random subsets of speakers, and we asked them to rate the speaker for their comprehensibility. How easy was it to understand the speaker? Or we asked them to try to transcribe what they heard from a speaker. So we took somebody's aptness speaking task response, broke it up into smaller chunks that were played one at a time, and people typed what they heard. And that was our measure of intelligibility. And so this is the interface. And we were mainly concerned, what's the relationship between the speaking scores and lay people who just have some sense of what English is in general, how they were able to understand the speakers. And so we found pretty strong correlations with intelligibility and also very high correlations with comprehensibility. Okay. And we, to look at the data a little bit more, we can see that as intelligibility goes up, so does proficiency, whether we're looking at raw scores or Cepher classifications. Same for comprehensibility, kind of similar trends here. Okay. We also have some regression results. What we sort of found that is most interesting here is we could explain, when we kind of took a nonlinear approach, we were able to explain about 80%, close to 80% of the proficiency test score with these listener-based measures of intelligibility and comprehensibility, right? So there's this connection here that they overlap a lot, how real people perceive English and the scores from the test. Okay, so again, we have some more detailed takeaways, but I won't dwell too much on this. The bigger one is that listeners, seems like they ought to have a pretty good sense of higher and lower on whatever the test scale is. All right, so there's 2 more studies to go. I know it's getting a little warm in here and it's after lunch, so hope you're all able to stay with me. Just check time for myself. I think we're doing okay. So this 4th study, this one I won't spend too much time on, hopefully, because it's still a study in progress. So I just want to put that out there. Here we're looking at the Pearson test of English and the academic version of that test. So this is something I'm working on with Hyung-Jo Yoon, who's a colleague who's at CSU Northridge. And we're going to be here finally sort of putting everything together, looking at both scores and linguistic characteristics of performance. So far we've been able to recruit 30 international students who are enrolled in first-year composition at CSUN. And you can see their age, their backgrounds. They've all been admitted to the university, so we don't have really low levels of proficiency, so it's a little bit of a truncated sample. And they completed the PT academic in a controlled setting, and they also did a task perception questionnaire. We were able to get some performances from their actual composition classes. So for writing, this is really good data. That's one thing that excites me about this study. We have 3 assignments from first-year composition classes that are graded by their instructors, and then we'll also be able to analyze those linguistically. For speaking, because there aren't really that many graded speaking assignments in composition classes, maybe unsurprisingly, we kind of had to create something that simulated a topic and something they would discuss in class. So we had them read a short sample essay and discuss the strengths and weaknesses of it with a TA, like what advice would they give to the writer. So something relevant to the composition class, like what they do in class, but admittedly this is sort of semi-authentic. We did it outside of class time. Okay. And so we're focusing on, for this study, it's still in progress, the describe an image task in the PTE. And so you can see here, they look at some presentation of data and have to summarize the trends, what's going on here. So that's the speaking. And then for the PTE, it has 1 essay task, and you can see an example here. So I won't read that all out, but it's fairly typical. It's kind of like an independent response. You know, they reflect on their own opinion or ideas and write an essay in 20 minutes. Okay, here's kind of how they were prompted for the semi-authentic speaking task. And then we asked them questions and so on. And then here were some of the assignments they received in their actual composition class. So these are highly authentic. They're even told they can't talk about the Amy Tan novel. They have to find something else. So you can see here, letter writing, narrative, and analysis. So we're getting some different genres. And for the speaking stuff, what we're seeing here is that our strongest correlations with the Pearson test of English speaking score and how they did on the authentic task, which we rated with a rubric, medium-sized correlations, it looks like, and then some of the linguistic aspects are not so closely related. For the writing tasks, we see the Pearson writing score and then the score on these 3 different writing tasks, so the grades that they were given. Small to medium-sized correlations. Okay. Looks a little bit better for the letter and the narrative than the analysis paper. And now we're going to get into some of the linguistic characteristics. So aside from these expert evaluations, what does their writing actually look like on a linguistic level? And so when we look at the task level, and if you recall from the beginning of the talk, I mentioned that a lot of previous studies did kind of focus on the task level. Like, starting with speaking here, is clause length on the PTE speaking on average similar to clause length for the same people on their authentic speaking tasks, where they gave feedback on a model essay? And we can find several instances where there are statistically significant differences in the mean level of test task and non-test task performance. Okay. Same for lexical dimensions. Okay. But when we look at correlations, again, this is very early. I don't want to jump to conclusions here, but like we saw some task level differences in syntactic complexity for speaking, but we actually see that they're correlated. So people who had relatively more complex syntax on the test had relatively more complex syntax in the semi-authentic speaking task. There's also some, maybe funny stuff going on here. The lexical density thing, I don't know what to quite make of it yet, that negative correlation. But again, this is still an in-progress study. For writing, again, if we look at task means, we can see that things like T-unit length, subordination, there are some task level differences between some of the tasks. Notably, there are task level differences between real-world tasks. So this is something that's been kind of illuminating about this project because we have several real-world tasks. We're able to see that there's, it really depends on what real-world task you're picking if you're making task-level comparisons. But when we look at correlations across the test writing and the real-world tasks, we're starting to see some things showing up consistently, not always in every task, but at least in some of the tasks. And so to me, this starts to highlight a real challenge in this line of research. Like, what do we expect here? Should we see positive and medium to strong correlations in every real-world task we sample? Or are we looking for patterns? Are we looking for an overall impression based on a lot of fine-grained results? So this is still an in-progress project. For scores and expert evaluations, we're seeing kind of what we'd expect, and that's a little bit easier to grasp. Humans don't really pay attention to T-unit length explicitly, but they can recognize good writing when they see it or clear speaking when they hear it. But the linguistic aspect is, it's mixed. It's difficult to, just take one quick look at and say, aha, okay, we've got good support. But also what's popping out here is that task level differences show up not just between test and non-test tasks, but among lots of non-test tasks. And in fact, corpus linguistics has been kind of shouting this for years, right? So if you look at people who do kind of multidimensional register analyses of language, say, yeah, the way we write emails is way different than the way we write academic articles or text our friends about, reality TV shows from last night, okay? Like, we use language differently in different contexts. So I think language testers need to keep that sort of basic fact of sociolinguistics in mind when we interpret this sort of evidence. All right, and so now this brings me to the fifth study, and this is probably the most elaborate, and it is now completed. We're just in the process of submitting, well, it just submitted the final report to ETS, and we've presented on it at a couple conferences. So again, this one was with Dustin Crowther, Jian Kim, and Yunseo Kim. And here, like the Pearson study, we have score data, we have linguistic characteristic data. Here, we're only looking at speaking, though. We recruited 199 participants. 149 of those, we were able to get sort of valid, complete TOEFL essential speaking data from ETS. And we were able to solve the problem, we hope, of the raised floor, right? The selection effect. We didn't only include admitted university students. We're able to recruit students who are in intensive English programs who intend to attend an English medium university, but are still at a lower proficiency level and aren't quite there yet. And we also have all the way through to graduate students. And so from these students, we were able to collect some semi-authentic academic tasks that we did in the lab. So just for having a couple of standardized things that were broadly academic in flavor and similar to what happens in real classes. And then for people who could make it work, they were invited to participate in stage 2 of the study, where they submitted an assignment from a course or otherwise related to their academic program. So these could be things like a presentation they did in class or a practice talk they gave for their department, but real world, fully authentic in some way. So the TOEFL Essentials, if you're not familiar with it, it looks quite different from the TOEFL IBT. It includes a read aloud task, right? So they just read what's on the screen. A listen and repeat task, right? And this one we see a little more often. It's on Pearson, it's on Duolingo. And then what they call a virtual interview. It's a series of short prompts all about a similar theme. And it's sort of like the simulated OPI that ACTFL does for the OPIC test. Okay? And just as a note, this one and this one, this is going to be the new speaking section of the TOEFL IBT in 2026. And then here were our semi-authentic lab tasks. So we used a graph description task. This is kind of something like Pearson does on their test, but also we see people, you have to talk about graphs a lot in the real world. And then we set up a new task called a lecture response. We created something that's sort of supposed to be like you listen to a lecture and then you participate in a little discussion about it. So we prepared an 8-minute lecture on bilingualism. We recruited a non-native speaking instructor to deliver this lecture, and then they had follow-up questions with somebody in the lab. And so a topic that's broadly relatable. The course itself qualifies as a general education requirement at our university, so broadly relevant to everybody who might be participating in the study. Okay, and then the course-based stuff, like I mentioned, they could submit something from their class. We left it pretty open because we know this is hard to do. It just had to be a minute long. We ended up taking a subset of what we got that were relatively complete presentations or other similar types of assignments. So now we're going to get into the results here. When we look at test scores and then the human ratings of these semi-authentic lab tasks, here are the correlations. So we get very strong stuff here. The TOEFL Essential Speaking Score correlated with graph description scores and lecture response scores in the mid-0.8s. And a lot of the individual task scores did almost as well. Okay, so the virtual interview task seems solid. Listen and repeat is also very respectable. The read aloud correlations are lower, but like 0.7 is still like pretty high. I mean, I wouldn't hold this against the read aloud task necessarily if we're making comparisons. For the course-based tasks, and this was a smaller subset, so we only had 65 people who submitted appropriate course-based tasks, and the correlations are a little bit lower, but they're still quite high. Everything's above 0.6. Okay, so these would all be considered large correlations. Now getting into what I see as being some of the really interesting stuff, we had a set of 17 linguistic features that we coded or tallied across all of the speaking samples, including the test speech and the real-world speech. So here we have our two lab tasks. The top row of results is the graph description. The bottom sort of panel, I should say, is the lecture response, where they had to discuss and reflect on the lecture. And what we can see here, I've sort of organized these complexity, accuracy, and fluency. I know it's a little bit hard to read the labels here, but we see a number of very strong correlations. So particularly for fluency, I think we're looking at mid-clause silent pause duration. So when people kind of stop in the middle of the clause, like, I think, and then they continue on, okay? And then also the overall speech rate or articulation rate. All right, so people who spoke faster on the test task tended to speak faster in the non-test task. We also see pretty high correlations for accuracy, especially as it relates to a couple of the pronunciation accuracy variables. Phonological substitutions, so switching, for example, L's and R's, right? That'd be a substitution error. That tended to be a very strong correlation. Complexity is more of a mixed bag. For the authentic task, again, we don't see quite as many significant correlations. It's a smaller sample size. We are correcting for multiple comparisons. But the broad pattern seems to kind of hold. There are some fluency features and some accuracy features that seem to be pretty consistent, even in these authentic course-based tasks, which I'll talk a little bit more about this later. They tend to be very rehearsed and prepared for, which makes sense. Actually, a lot of higher stakes speaking that we do in academic settings is something we've either fully scripted, semi-scripted, we might have slides we're working off, or we've practiced a couple times. So despite that kind of preparation, we're seeing some of these processing and competence-related factors, accuracy, come out again. But again, complexity is more of a mixed bag here, and overall lower correlations. So kind of what we're seeing, or the way I'm starting to interpret this, is accuracy and fluency. We're kind of adopting that broad CAF framework. These seem to tap into aspects of the construct that have to do with linguistic competence, right? Like, do you have these sort of grammar rules somehow in your mental language in your interlanguage, and fluency, how efficiently, how much facility do you have with processing language, that holds up. That is a pretty strong signal. We seem to be able to observe that in test and non-test. Complexity is a little bit harder, whether we're looking at syntactic aspects of complexity or lexical, which I know some people prefer to kind of treat that separately, like lexical sophistication. But either way, a lot of that form use, the specific forms, the clausal structures, phrase structures, types of phrases we use, lexical items we use, those seem to be a little bit more context dependent. And so task and context seem to play a bigger role in the language we use, understandably. And so we don't quite see as strong of correlations. And kind of similar things for the course-based tasks, similar patterns, but again, considerable preparation and scripting for some of these higher stakes, because most people were submitting presentations for a class. Mostly they were pretty good students and they prepared for their presentations, so they kind of were able to plan out, especially a lot of what language forms they were going to use for their presentations. All right, so starting to wrap this up, and I'll start with some methodological notes. So the TOEFL project in particular, and starting to, hopefully this carries through with the Pearson project that's still in progress, and comparing to some of the previous research, work, it's good work, it's interesting work by Riazi, Brown and Ducasse, and I'm forgetting the other paper already. But through all of this, I'm seeing that it's really important that maybe some of the strongest evidence we get is from within-person analyses. Observe the people taking the test, and then observe them in the real world. I think if we're not doing analyses too that are on that person level, like a correlation, we're missing a big part of the picture. If we only look at task level differences, this group of 100 people, what was their syntactic complexity on the test task? For this group of 100 people, what was their syntactic complexity on the non-test task? Those kind of results tell us about task differences. They don't tell us about for a person, and the person is who we make decisions about when we use test scores in the real world. It doesn't tell us whether the person exhibits similar relative levels of performance across the domains. Okay. So that to me, I think is an important methodological note. We always see this with the score-based comparisons, right? If we look at students who take the test and their grades on assignments in freshman composition classes, those are always person-level analyses. I hope we start applying that same sort of approach to linguistic analyses. Another note here too is task sampling. We sort of take for granted, I guess, that the test tasks, well, they're just the test tasks, right? So test developers do things like needs analyses or domain analyses to come up with a principled selection of tasks to include on the test, right? And it's a limited number because we don't have a lot of time to give people language tests, so we take what we get. For the real world, we say, oh yeah, something from the real world. The real world, that's a big universe of tasks we could be sampling from. And this is something where, I want to cast some doubt or skepticism on my own work here. Did we pick the right real world tasks? Is the graph description, is the lecture response, or is the simulated feedback on a model essay? Those are, in a sense, authentic, right? They are a reasonably good source of data, but we could end up with very different findings if we tried other sorts of tasks. Like what if we recorded people coming into their advising meeting? At my university, undergraduates have mandatory advising meetings. What if we somehow were able to record those? That would be cool. I think the IRB would be really hard to get for that. But it would be a very different kind of speaking event and context, and it might throw a little bit of a wrench in some of these findings. I'm not sure. Right? But I think we have to think hard about this. It's also easy to stack the deck, potentially. Are we picking real-world tasks that happen to be very similar to the test tasks? That's something I think to be on guard for. And then how many? We've seen variation across real-world tasks. How many real-world tasks do we need to get a broad read, a general pattern? Again, I'm not sure. More is probably better, but then we run into practicality constraints. One kind of bigger picture issue coming out of this body of research, and I'd like to say I had thought about this well in advance of doing my first extrapolation-related study, but I hadn't. I think I tended to focus on one study at a time. But now sort of zooming out and looking at the literature more broadly across these different types of extrapolation studies, strength of evidence. So when I started reading, going back to these validity arguments for TOEFL Essentials, for other tests, oftentimes you see that there's supposed to be a relationship between test scores and a real-world indicator, or linguistic characteristics on the test in the real world. There's supposed to be a relationship, presumably positive. The TOEFL IBT argument specifically says a positive relationship, which we would expect. But is that enough? I mean, because from a statistical perspective, if you have a large enough sample size, even very tiny positive correlations will be different from zero. They will be a relationship. So what kind of correlations would be persuasive, right? Because persuasion is actually what we're looking for in validity arguments. Not just, oh, we found a significant correlation coefficient. Is the size of it persuasive? So starting to think a little bit, like how do we set standards of evidence? I don't want to say that this is like a final, like here's what we should all follow. But in general, it seems like general indicators like GPA, maybe job performance, we might not expect extremely large correlations. So something positive on the smaller side is maybe all we can expect. We're looking at narrower indicators like performance on specific language-intensive tasks in a target domain. We might expect medium correlations. And then if we're looking at stakeholder evaluations of language performance, like does this person, would they be able to handle the language-related duties at your work? We should expect those to be pretty high, right? So we've seen that in a couple of these stakeholder evaluation studies. And then I would say that for performance characteristics, if you're not comparing to the same people, I don't think that's really extrapolation evidence anymore. I think those kind of corpus linguistic studies are not bad studies, but I think it's probably better to reframe those as being relevant to what Chappell would call a domain definition inference. So not just is the task like a real-world task, but does the task elicit discourse that is like real-world discourse? So that's a task and content question to me. It doesn't really tell us so much about performance characteristics of individuals. But I don't know, maybe some people would argue with me on that. For subjective evaluations of performance characteristics, I think medium to large. And then the linguistic characteristics, this has to be nuanced. And I think we need more research in this area to start figuring out what construct relevant variables, linguistic characteristics, should we expect larger correlations for? Maybe there are some that aren't going to really be consistent across many tasks at all. But this is something I think that we need to know more about. But the way I'm thinking of it, if it's a linguistic characteristic that we can tie through theory and previous research to sort of a core language processing capacity, right? Maybe we expect medium and higher. If it's not, if it's more about language form use, we know that's going to be more contextually dependent. Maybe our expectations can justifiably be a little bit lower here when we think about task influences. But some limitations here, those, again, these are very loose guidelines. Don't cite this or anything yet, please. Those require qualification too. Because there are a lot of things that impact correlations and other sorts of similar quantitative analyses, like restriction of range. So we can think of that in terms of proficiency range. If we're only looking at admitted graduate students, the floor on that is like B2 or higher level proficiency. We're missing a lot of the picture. There's also another assumption with correlation and linear regression in general, like non-linearity, right? Linear regression, the line is supposed to be straight. Okay. If you have a relationship that's not quite linear, we need to account for that, right? That's going to sort of mess with our correlation coefficients or similar analyses. And I also think, too, preparation. This is something that's going to dampen a lot of our sources of evidence when it comes to these finer grained linguistic features. People who might have lower language proficiency but very good study skills, they will apply that sort of study skill to say, all right, I need to prepare my presentation. I'm going to go to the writing center. I'm going to get a friend to look at it before I turn it in. Okay? So we need to be aware of these factors when evaluating the strength of quantitative evidence we're seeing. And now I'm going to get a little bit further out, bigger picture stuff, coming back to constructs. I think, even though it's still a little bit early, I think we should be embracing more trait-like constructs. And embracing that in terms of the type of extrapolation evidence we do, or that we aim to collect. So I think, when Kane wrote back in 2013, his sort of widely cited article on argument-based validity, and he'd been writing on it for a while before that. When Chappelle and her colleagues were working on the TOEFL IBT validity argument back in 2005, there's, I think, less confidence in what do we know about language and language ability. And Kane isn't even necessarily a language person, so he's thinking about like certification exams for accountants, pilots, things like that, lawyers. But I think we have a pretty strong sense, at least at a cognitive level, of how language works in the mind. Not a hyper-detailed sort of model, but I think enough to where we know what sort of linguistic characteristics to look for. And especially research on fluency and language processing, I think, provides a lot of support. Because I think we need to realize that a task might not be similar, a test task might not be similar to too many real-world tasks, but the construct it elicits might be highly relevant. And so in the TOEFL Essentials study in particular, I was quite honestly surprised by how well the read aloud task and performance on that task seemed to relate to performance in the real world. And you were maybe wondering about all the blanks in that table of correlations. That's because some things on the read aloud task, they're not relevant to the real world at all. Like we can't look at syntactic complexity when we gave him a script. Everybody's reading the same number of clauses, okay? So it's limited in what it can do, but for what it can do, what aspects of the construct it can tap into and elicit, I think we shouldn't write that off so quickly. And so I think, yeah, if we lean into constructs, at least the cognitive aspects of the constructs we're trying to assess, I think we can use that to motivate good extrapolation research. And just to highlight this a little bit more, some of the task difference medians. I showed you this for the PTE, but here's some from the TOEFL. So now we're looking at the virtual interview, which is arguably the most authentic TOEFL task, and then one of the lab tasks, the graph description. You can see at the task level, the average articulation rate is faster in the virtual interview than it is in the graph description, okay? Fine, but you look at that correlation, the people who were faster speakers on the test tend to produce speech more quickly in real life. So we see that in a number of places. The correlations look like this. So if you look at the task level, you might conclude, oh, this task is too different from the real world. Not so good for extrapolation. If you look at the correlations, you're looking at all these like, all right, yeah, this seems to capture a lot about the person's language ability. The same one for the read aloud, because again, that was one, we don't see quite as strong correlations. We see the task differences, but we also see that there are some considerable correlations. And this was from the course-based project. Okay, so the furthest away from the test conceptually. So to end here, to move on, I think I'm still doing okay on time. All right, we should still have a little bit of time for questions. This is a little bit more provocative. I'm wondering now, has the field of language testing maybe over-invested on authenticity? So we're seeing some big developments in the language testing world. Tests like Duolingo have become much more widely used, and they feature some tasks that are much more constrained. TOEFL Essentials adopts a couple of these constrained type of tasks, and now TOEFL IBT is going to be moving away from their integrated speaking task, for example, which was argued to be highly authentic based on detailed domain analyses of English medium higher education, where you read things, you listen to lectures, and you talk about it in class. Again, that was sort of the thrust behind TOEFL IBT that took it away from a test that was maybe too grammar and vocab heavy. I think it took it in a positive direction, But I think the influence of TOEFL and IELTS, going for authenticity, maybe we've leaned too far in one direction. Again, but the initial reasoning was solid. If you want to elicit the same construct as that's relevant to the real world, well, just create similar situational tasks and contexts that are similar to the real world. You'll get the same performance. But we always run into a sacrifice. Our test tasks are never truly like real world tasks. And so we might be missing out on some efficiencies from adopting less authentic tasks that can still help us assess the same kinds of constructs. And again, high authenticity at the task level still doesn't pin down what is being measured. We still need theory that sort of ties something to a trait-like construct, I think, in my view. I think we have that theory, we should be drawing on it. So kind of rebalancing here, can we, as a field of language testing, are we going to see more of a return to psycholinguistics? Maybe we already have. Alistair Van Moore, who is somebody who's been working on the Pearson test of English for over a decade or so now, he wrote something to this effect in 2012. Before Duolingo was the popular test to criticize, it was the Pearson test of English. There were some pretty vigorous debates in language testing and language assessment quarterly after that test came out. And Van Moore wrote something that, basically we can selectively use more controlled tasks. If you orient your construct a little bit more psycholinguistically, you can make a defensible language test that back then, their innovation was automated scoring of speech. But also it relied on more controlled tasks because the technology at the time wasn't so good that we could evaluate spontaneous, more kind of communicative speech. Okay, so we shouldn't go back to like the old sort of psycholinguistic approach, closed tests only and things like that. But we might be able to take advantage now of better technology, and I think too, the two recent decades of research in psycholinguistics and sort of cognitive approaches to SLA have really enriched our understanding of how language develops and how proficiency develops. So maybe we can take advantage of that, not go fully psycholinguist. We're not going to be, just giving people like GJTs and serial reading tests, kind of things. But can we incorporate some of those principles to sort of make more efficient tests, make tests that are still valid with respect to the construct, but without only relying on task authenticity or without task authenticity being our main source of argument? So I'll go ahead and stop there. Thank you. Thanks again to Saibro University of Foreign Studies. I'm not much of a graphic designer, but like hearts and stars, thanks guys. Really appreciated the opportunity to speak to you all today.